research. So we could classify our research in any one of those ways, and they would be equally valued. And I was telling Patty on the drive over here, what was fascinating to me in that was that in conversations I had with junior faculty in my college, very candid sort of conversations that don't happen very often, one of the women of color who was sort of listening to this whole conversation take place came up to me at one point. She said, I really like this definition that we have of engaged research, because that's the work that I do. And then she said to me, but do you think you could give me a definition of basic research? Which was really fascinating to me, because we talk about this all the time on our campuses, and I'm not sure that we really know what we're talking about. And she actually had the guts sort of to say, I'm not really sure what that even means in the context of the work that I do. Okay? So a continuum of research, not privileging certain kinds of research over the other, and being really clear about what we mean when we talk about different kinds of research on the campus. All right, proposition 4. Multiple pathways to engagement are reflected in institutional engagement. So what I mean by that is, this comes from a document from the Association of Commonwealth Universities. Wonderful work being done in New Zealand and Australia around engagement. So they talk about engagement here as implying this interaction with the non-university world in 4 spheres. So let's just sort of unpack this a little bit. Setting university aims, purposes, and priorities, right? And that's when we talk about mission. Right? The mission of the university is, right? So the mission of this university in terms of its public purpose, right, is connected to the outside world. Relating teaching and learning to the wider world, right? So engaged, community-based service learning, teaching and learning. The back and forth dialogue between researchers and practitioners. You actually used that language this morning, exactly that language, that interchange, that reciprocity in knowledge generation. And then taking on wider responsibility as neighbors and citizens, right? This idea of deep partnerships. We have an obligation to partner with those outside the university. So we can take that then and put it into this kind of model where, again, going back to the classification, those campuses that got the classification had all of these pathways, not just some of them, but all of them. The mission pathway came out in the beginning parts of the classification framework around institutional culture and commitment, presidential statement, strategic plan, right? What's the mission? Does the mission articulate community engagement? Right? So that was part of it. Pedagogical pathway, right? All the questions about curricular engagement, connections to the community, whole section on outreach and partnerships. But then there's another part too, and I really want to emphasize this one. What I'm talking about here is the epistemological pathway. That was embedded in questions like, have you changed your promotion and tenure guidelines? Do they value the scholarship of community engagement? How is it valued? Okay. And if you didn't have all of these pathways, you didn't get the classification. Right? Because to be an engaged university means that you have to have all of them. That's what institutional engagement means. So coming back to this epistemological one, because I think that's the one, for me anyway, that we don't pay enough attention to. And yet it's, in many ways, I would argue, the most critical one. And again, this comes from a document out of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And if anything, it's the first line here, which is the most important. And it goes back to what Linton was talking about in the ecosystem. It goes back to what Boyer was talking about in this shift from application to engagement, is that the pursuit of knowledge itself demands engagement. Okay? It's not a choice. And if we really are to produce new knowledge, we have to engage. You can't just do it sitting in the academy. It doesn't work anymore. It's not legitimate knowledge generation. You've got to engage with other knowledge centered outside the university. It demands engagement. It's fundamentally epistemological. And the other way that I would think about this is that this document does not argue any of those other pathways. It's not arguing we got to do this because we need to be a good partner. It's not arguing we need to do it because it's in our mission. It's not arguing that we need to do it because it's better teaching and learning. It says the pursuit of knowledge demands it. The other things will flow out of that, but that's what's at the core of academic work. I just want to give you an example of how this begins to play out. So in the University of Pennsylvania, this is a statement from a former dean there, where she talks about the creation of knowledge in a democratic society. So there's another frame then that comes out of this reciprocity, which is fundamentally a democratic framework. Universities engage multiple partners in the production of knowledge. So reciprocity then tied to this democratic framing. So that takes me to Proposition 5. Engagement reflects a democratic purpose. And this, I'm just referring you to the white paper that Terry talked about earlier. So in that white paper, what we looked at was these different frameworks for engagement. And I'll just briefly walk you through this. On this side, this is what we said was what we see happening on many campuses across the country, and I would argue also internationally, is that there is what they call civic engagement going on, but it's civic engagement of a particular kind. And it's civic engagement where there's talk about partnerships and mutuality, but it would also be, we would argue, coming out of a deficit framework where there are problems in the community that we're going to go solve. Academic work is done for the community, for the public. It's applied work, it's unidirectional flow of knowledge, it comes out of this positivistic, technocratic framework of knowledge production. Makes a distinction between those who produce the knowledge and those who consume the knowledge, and you can sort of follow this through. The university is the center of public problem solving. It leads to this form of apolitical engagement because it doesn't foster a culture, a public culture of democracy outside, either inside or outside the university. And knowledge generation and dissemination comes through community involvement, but it doesn't come through doing it with the community. So there's a lot of this going on. I would also argue that what we are saying in the Democratic Engagement White Paper is that this doesn't actually ask us to do anything differently. We can be the same university we've always been and do this. It doesn't require that fourth quadrant that we were talking about earlier. It doesn't require any kind of transformational change because we can do this as the university that we've always been. What we're arguing for is something different. And this goes towards that fourth quadrant, and it really asks for transformational change, a change in the culture of the institution. And you'll see it starts with reciprocity. Right? Reciprocity is fundamentally different, and it changes everything. Right? Moves us to an asset-based approach where we don't see the community as simply having problems and deficits, but having strengths. And how do we draw on those strengths, bring them together? The community has legitimate knowledge, right? And we need to draw on that knowledge. Those are the assets. Bring them together with academic knowledge. Academic work is done with the public, not for the public. It's inclusive, collaborative, problem-oriented, multi-directional flow of knowledge, co-creation of knowledge, all the things that we've just been talking about. Right? All of those flow out of reciprocity. They fundamentally ask us to change the institution. It goes to the core of the culture of the academy. And it's fundamentally out of a democratic framework, much like the dean at Penn was talking about. Here's the change piece which goes along with this. So the other part which comes out of the paper is many of the campuses that are on the civic engagement side, not the democratic civic engagement side, they're going through a change process, right? Much like the first two quadrants in Echo Hill and Green. They are going through change, but it's not changing the institution. It's not transformational. And so what we're talking about when we talk about the democratic civic engagement is what we're talking about is second order change, which actually might be useful as we think about building on our successes. How do we make sure that we focus on second order changes as we continue to build an engaged campus? And if you look at this, it's many of the things that we just talked about going to the core of the culture. All right, I want to go back to that study that I referred to earlier. And in the end, we had 7 campuses that had revised their promotion and tenure guidelines to specifically articulate community-engaged work in teaching, scholarship, and research, and service. 7. Right? So we're not talking about a lot of campuses. And while they're